There's something strange brewing in the air. It's as if the world had collectively experienced a bad trip and we are now in the process of trying our best to pretend it never happened. Presently, we stare into an uneasy future of ecological chaos, rising xenophobia, and economic uncertainty. The precariousness of our reality was briefly revealed, and despite this, we nonetheless hope that we can just go back to business as usual. But the cat's out of the bag. What was seen cannot be unseen. A collective humility has settled on the many who, with great conviction, once operated as isolated creatures and atomized beings. For better or worse, we now know that our lives are intimately entangled with the sloppy, stupid, and strangely beautiful presence of others. Of course, not all of us have conceded. Those against vaccination, for example, loudly protest against it on the basis of vaccines being an attack on their personal freedom of choice. They argue that it is a violent intrusion against their bodies that they have outright ownership over. However, as Zizek cynically responds, as if our body is ever really just ours, vaccinated or not, we are already controlled and manipulated in ways we are unaware of. Despite Zizek's language, it should be noted that this assertion extends beyond conspiratorial assumptions. He is simply pointing towards a truth shared by neuroscientists, Buddhist monks, and shroom-loving hippies. Everything is connected. The existence of a distinct entity, the isolated self, is an illusion. And, on a certain level of analysis, to claim ownership over your identity is absurd. I am you, and you are me, and we are everything that has been and will be. This is best described under the monk Thich Nhat Hanh's notion of interbeing. Han believes that we are entirely composed of many elements he calls non-me elements. These elements of your father, your mother, your ancestors, the stars, the moon, the mountains, and the animals come together to briefly form you. You are simply a continuation of these elements. Everything is in you, so you can talk to them and you know that you are the world. You are the cosmos. Additionally, interbeing avoids the tired calls of humanism that propose that there is a common human nature by suggesting that, more importantly, there is a common nature that we are a part of. We are a continuation of the natural world, composed of those same elements present at the very beginning of the universe. We are not just related to each other, but also to the rocks, the bumblebees, and even horse manure. As an eternal stream of non-me elements, we are never truly alone. Importantly, interbeing is supported by interpersonal neurobiology, the study of how the brain, body, and mind are developed in the context of relationships, both with others and the environment. Specifically, interpersonal neurobiology investigates phenomena such as mirror neurons that fire both when an animal acts and when the animal observes the same action performed by another. The existence of mirror neurons explain the rapid development of kids, as these neurons fire when a child observes the intentional action of someone else, and also when they perform the action. They also fire when you observe what someone else is feeling, something that we tend to call empathy. This additionally explains the existence of emotional contagion, when our moods are influenced by the moods of others. Overall, interpersonal neurobiology highlights the influence of others on our brains and the shared mind that we all engage in. Daniel Siegel, the main thinker behind interpersonal neurobiology, sees the fruitfulness of uniting neuroscience with the Buddhist principles of interbeing. I believe, and cannot find any science to disprove, that an important aspect of the mind can be defined as an embodied and relational emergent self-organizing process that regulates the flow of energy and information both within us and between and among us. The mind isn't installed in your brain. Rather, it's in those moments of exchange between minds, when the barriers of individualism break down, where we become truly conscious. Siegel goes on to argue that once we realize that the true definition of the self is a collective we, a certain hope for the planet begins to emerge. We begin to realize this is our collective home. There is a real hope to turn things around. Of course, unlike monks and neuroscientists, most of us don't walk around aware of the interdependence of everything. but Bruno Latour does point towards the lockdowns as making us more conscious of our existence as an interconnected community sharing the same planet. As he argues, before the pandemic, we were fairly unaware of the whole host of jobs that allowed for our survival. Catering jobs, deliverers, nurses, caretakers, a whole drove of people as poorly paid as they were poorly viewed. Now, thanks to the evident breaking down of supply chains, labor strikes, service closures, and the piling of bodies, we are intimately aware of the importance of these essential services. Carrying out the simplest course of action, like feeding yourself, required the support of quite a few agents to ensure continuity of the most ordinary life. We became a captive audience to a truth we wish to have forgotten, that in spite of our personalized journeys towards self-actualization, we nonetheless rely largely on others for our continued survival. In fact, Latour argues that anyone who wants to claim ownership over some sort of personal identity should be laughed at. Here he makes the distinction between two ecological groups, autotrophs and heterotrophs. Autotrophs are those amazing organisms that do in fact feed themselves by taking up all they need to live on. Fungi and trees don't really rely on other terrestrial beings to continue their subsistence. On the other hand, heterotrophs, that is, all animals including humans, depend on a sometimes overwhelming phantom body of other terrestrials for their own existence. For example, we rely on the waste of the autotrophs, oxygen, as well as the niche building and energy of other heterotrophs. Therefore, it is only the autotrophs, and not, for example, the libertarian Texan, that deserves the right to call themselves an individual and atomized entity. As Latour writes, if there is any race that cannot lay claim to be made up of individuals delineated much like wire figures inside a secure border, that is indeed the modern human. In the end, Latour endorses the use of the term holobionts instead of organisms, which means a collection of actors in the form of clouds with blurred contours and durable membranes. Holobionts capture the fact that even at our most selfish, we still miscalculate how to pursue our interests. The mistakes and accidents that stem from our behavior unintentionally spill into the selfish strivings of others, forming a cluster of engendering concerns. Even at our most selfish, the individual struggles to truly exist. Well, then why do we act as if this isn't the case? Instead, we tend to behave as isolated units who don't owe anyone anything. We have gradually eliminated engendering concerns, and, with some genuine reason, we greet ideas of conformity and community with suspicion. Why is this? Well, most of us want to self-realize, to be authentic. We spend much of our time crafting ourselves as projects to be worked on, hoping to uncover our true selves and maybe even experience self-actualization. We value spontaneous emotion, something that is apparently authentic, and find ourselves skeptical of behaviors and opinions that have been formed in some way, especially from outside influence. We are deeply skeptical of conformity and use terms such as sheep or NPC to degrade those who fail to be their own main character. Most of all, we strive to become who we want to be. Of course, to do this, one must be in isolation, as we're told. The potential imposition of others on one's life journey would be an abject failure in being true to ourselves. But how do you maintain isolation when so much of your survival evidently depends on others? Here, money plays a crucial role in affording such isolation. As Byung-Chul Han writes, money by itself has an individualizing and isolating effect. It increases my individual freedom by liberating me from any personal bonds with others. I can have someone else work for me by paying her, and this avoids entering into a personal relationship. I don't need to form a deep relationship with the barista, the farmer, the banker. Instead, thanks to my noise-canceling headphones, I can make sure all of my basic needs are met without ever personally knowing these fellow terrestrials. My self-indulgent yoga practice can continue because I can pay for food delivery. My journey to be who I want to be is now left uninterrupted by human interaction, and this is largely thanks to the exchange of money. Of course, in this beautifully symbiotic relationship, capital and authenticity form a feedback loop. It's very marketable to be unique and fully realized as an individual, and so we exploit ourselves voluntarily in the belief that we are realizing ourselves. This, of course, allows money to be accumulated and then recirculated. As Hahn explains, in the cult of authenticity, the neoliberal regime appropriates the person himself and turns him into a highly efficient site of production. The whole person is incorporated into the production process. We make money to self-actualize, and we self-actualize to make money. Our drive for authenticity as heroic individuals is very much tied up in our survival. Regrettably, this whole compulsion to be individuals hasn't really made us any happier. Byung-Chul Han sees this excessive relation to the self, which is incapable of leaving the self behind, as a wide-reaching narcissism. We withdraw into our little shells and the world disappears. Circling around ourselves, a feeling of emptiness develops and we no longer feel at home. We become depressed. And this isn't just theoretical. One 2021 meta-analysis found that across 14 different studies, individualism was consistently associated with reduced life satisfaction and depression in young people. Globally, individualism has increased over the last 50 years, alongside depression. These authors posit that, in conclusion, the modern social environment is more competitive, inequitable, and lonely. This deterioration of social cohesion among modern industrialized populations may be a central component to rising rates of depression. Overall, in The Disappearance of Rituals, Han points to this obsessive compulsion to produce oneself as leading towards a crisis of community, and from this, a depressed and lonely world. This is seen in the end of ritual participation. Rituals, he writes, make us feel at home in the world. They create resonant relationships, vertically to the gods, to space, to time, horizontally between peoples and social communities, and diagonally with objects and things. As he argues, without resonance, we are thrown back onto ourselves isolated. Increasing narcissism works against the experience of resonance. Social media echo chambers, for example, only lead to self-resonation, where we solely hear our own voices and opinions. This only strengthens the echoes of the self. Rituals, on the other hand, invite the foreign and that which is different, thereby offering a stable space for creativity and revolutionary potential to flourish. I'm sure the mention of revolution has led to a few eye rolls. And by now, I'm sure you can tell that this subject of interconnectedness and my criticism of capitalism leans in a specific political direction. This is perhaps best summed up by Terry Eagleton's distinction between socialism and capitalism. Both systems, taken at their most utopian, focus on human flourishing as an end goal. Capitalism sees competition, the pursuit of everyone's self-interest, as the tool to achieve this goal. It is through opposition to each other where we will flourish. Socialism, on the other hand, claims that human flourishing will come not in opposition to each other, but rather through each other. It is through cooperation and sharing a common interest that we create a better world. Now, has the necessary illusion of the self and the disappearance of rituals paved the way for scientific innovation, greater material wealth, and knowledge? Undoubtedly, yes. But I would also argue that this emphasis on solitary self-realization has outworn its welcome. We are more depressed, we are more lonely. We face a revolving door of potential global catastrophes, and as Zizek writes, our multicultural, globalized societies are societies whose spirit is tired, unable to engage in a large-scale, passionate project which may demand from us that we even risk our lives. It's a spiritual malaise, a crisis of meaning, whatever you'd like to call it. One way of capturing this growing despair is in terms of Mark Fisher's hauntology and capitalist realism. Fisher argued that the future has effectively been cancelled, and we find ourselves no longer capable of imagining new futures. This is evident in capitalist realism, where we can no longer imagine any alternatives to our current economic system. It's simply impossible to imagine a future without capitalism in some form. And Fisher was markedly aware of the sorts of isolation that capitalism encouraged. The installation of capitalist realism was by no means a simple restoration of an old state of affairs. The mandatory individualism imposed by neoliberalism was a new form of individualism. Yes, Fisher was kind of a bummer. His work is highly cynical of the future ahead. However, Fisher did hold an idea of the future that could counter this mandatory individualism. He believed that our inability to imagine new futures forces us to look back in history to past ideas of what the future could be. Revolution, then, means not to generate new utopian visions, but instead to unforget the worlds that were previously imagined. For Fisher, the most worthy adversary to our present system is in the psychedelic movement of the 60s and 70s. In reflecting on psychedelia, Fisher notes its emphasis on interconnection and community. It feels like an actual social space, one you can imagine really existing. You are as likely to come upon a crank or a huckster as a poet or a musician here, and who knows if today's crank might turn out to be tomorrow's genius. It is also an egalitarian and democratic space, and a certain affect presides over everything. There is multiplicity, but little sign of resentment or malice. It is a space for fellowship, for meeting and talking as much for having your mind blown. From this, Fisher developed a vision of the future he provocatively named acid communism. This vision, which blended class consciousness, feminism, and psychedelic thought under a communist project, was to function in opposition to neoliberal individualism. Acid communism promotes a breakdown of borders and identity, and a greater awareness for just how connected we are. And importantly, it appears very different from what Fisher called the harsh Leninist superego, the common communist idea of individuals single-mindedly dedicated to the revolution and the use of violence and suppression to achieve said revolution. In contrast to the dreary aesthetic of past regimes, Fisher put forth a vision that celebrated interconnection and coming together. Hence, he emphasizes the sort of love found through psychoactive substances, rather than anger as a motivating force in the revolution. Evidently, the use of psilocybin has been linked to heightened empathy and creativity, as well as the sort of felt connection with nature emphasized in Interbeing. This suggests that collective usage may promote a greater concern for nature, as well as one's relationships with others, and potentially even the creative thinking that could surpass capitalist realism. Of course, the promises of the 60s did not come to pass, which Fisher largely blames on insufficient material conditions. The heavy regulation of these substances has also played a role. This is captured in the words of Terence McKenna. Psychedelics are illegal not because a loving government is concerned that you may jump out of a third-story window. Psychedelics are illegal because they dissolve opinion structures and culturally laid down models of behavior and information processing. They open you up to the possibility that everything you know is wrong. Fisher believes that we now have better material conditions than the 60s, but also lack the sort of emotional and existential conditions to bring about this possible future. The rigid atomization of our lives has only left us dejected from forming any sort of movement. The question remains as to whether such a vision of acid communism is even possible, or if we have simply given up on getting together. If, in the words of Juvenal, we have lost the reason to live for the sake of staying alive. Of course, this video is just a roundabout way of saying that love will save us, which isn't a very revolutionary or unique statement, but there's got to be some level of truth in its simplicity and timeless appeal. And evidently, healing the world through love holds certain political implications. It's a recognition of interconnectedness and a rejection of atomization. It's a return to rituals over our personal attempts at self-realization. And it's a revival of the optimism of 60s psychedelia over the pessimism of capitalist realism. Yes, it holds a socialist bias, but importantly, Fisher never imagines a specific utopia. He does not claim that such a revolution will manifest in anything in particular. What he is concerned with is manifesting a certain optimism. And that's why I obviously can't claim that a revolution will look like this or like that, but it's always good to have an idea of where we could shoot for. There is, however, perhaps one clear objective to come out of this thesis. To recognize interbeing is to be aware of our entangled existence, of not simply living in the world, but rather of being at home in a shared world. For whatever reason, most of our history has involved trying to escape this fact. Through visions of the afterlife and utopias, we have consistently sought salvation beyond the earth. Nowadays, some of us use their vast wealth in an attempt to fully escape the dreaded connection with others. They wish to escape to other planets or plunge themselves into virtual reality. They wish to be anywhere but here. And it is this observation that concerns Bruno Latour. After the lockdown, it is apparent that our common enemy lies in those who see themselves detached from the rest of us wretched and entangled creatures. Lockdown of the world, unite. You have the same enemies, the people who'd like to escape to another planet.